Hi, everyone. Welcome to the webinar. I'm Hanovi Schoonover, Operations Specialist at Redmond Consulting, and I'll be hosting this event. Before I begin, for those who may not know, Redmond is a nonprofit organization that provides tribal technical assistance on a variety of programs, including, but not limited to, tribal comprehensive, responding to urban natives, and elder abuse. This ranges from policy review via email to site visits. If you are interested, you can contact me at hanovi@red-wind.net. That's HONOVI at red-wind.net. You can also visit our website at red-wind.net, and you do need to remember to keep that dash in, otherwise you'll get a casino. But on that website, you'll be able to find additional information on services we provide, upcoming events, and resources such as handouts and guidebooks that you can download. As this states, this presentation was brought to you in partnership by Redmond Consulting. This project is supported by grant number 15J OVW 21 GK 02258 TRIB, awarded by the Office on Violence Against Women, U.S. Department of Justice. The opinions, findings, conclusions, and recommendations expressed in this publication, program, exhibition are those of the authors and do not necessarily reflect the views of the U.S. Department of Justice. This webinar is a part of our Tribal College Campus project, and this event does have captioning, which you'll need to manually turn on from the menu. It'll look like a little CC icon. If you have any questions or comments, you can put them into the chat box or the Q&A section on the bottom of your screen, or you can click the little hand icon. You'll all be muted, so if we see the hand, we'll be able to then unmute you so you can ask your questions verbally. If there are any tech issues, you can send a private message to me and we'll try to get that resolved. And I'll now turn it over to our wonderful presenters.
Thank you, Hanovi. Can you go to the next slide? Thank you. So hi, everybody. I'm Dr. Emily Wright. I am a Principal Research Associate at the Urban Institute. I'm also an enrolled member of the Cherokee Nation. And my esteemed colleague over there is Dr. Tara Richards. She's an associate professor in the School of Criminology and Criminal Justice at the University of Nebraska, Omaha. We have been working together for several years. We were both at the University of Nebraska at Omaha for a little bit until fairly recently when I moved over to the Urban Institute, but we're really excited to be able to continue to do work together and to do things like this with our webinars and our presentations, especially to share the results of much of the work that we have done. Primarily, our research tends to focus on gender-based violence and victimization, including domestic intimate partner violence, sexual assault. We've been doing some work on the issue of missing persons for several years now. And we've been working with Redwind and OVW over that time period to think about how to improve responses to sexual victimization on college campuses, as well as how to improve responses and the reporting of, and really just to understand more about the issue of missing and murdered Indigenous persons. So if we could go to the next slide, that'd be awesome. So today we're going to talk about three things. Hopefully by the end of this webinar, you will better understand the scope of missingness among Indigenous persons, those factors that may increase the risk of going missing. We'll also talk about the potential connection between going missing and gender-based violence, so sexual assault, dating or domestic violence, sex trafficking, and things like that. And then we'll talk about how to report missing persons and hopefully debunk a few myths in that realm as well. Next slide, please. So let's talk first about the issue of missingness and missingness among Indigenous persons in particular, and also talk about some of those factors that might increase one's risk for going missing. Next slide. So many of you, I'm sure, on this webinar are here because the issue of missing MMIP, missing and murdered Indigenous people, has really gained a lot of attention in the US in the last several years. And you probably are aware of it vicariously. Maybe you work as a victim service provider. Maybe you are a tribal member and this is a concerning issue. And so we're happy that you are here, wanting to listen to some of the things that we've uncovered in our research. But it's important not to confound the two issues, going missing and then being murdered. They don't always happen together. So today we're actually just talking about missingness. And a lot of times when I talk about MMIP as a problem, because that's really the way that it's been talked about sort of on a national scale. But it's important that we are just focusing on missing persons right now. What do we mean by missing person? Well, that's someone who we don't know where they're at and we can't confirm their well-being. We don't know if they are in danger or not. Next slide, please. Now, I think originally there was a lot of concern that the issue of missingness was directly and almost always related to criminal activity. So, someone went missing and then they were found to have been murdered. And that can certainly happen. They can go missing, and that could be directly related to criminal activity. Perhaps they've been taken and they're going to be forced into sex trafficking or something like that. But is not always associated with criminal behavior, because some people, they can go missing intentionally or unintentionally. So for instance, someone who has a substance abuse problem or perhaps mental health problems, they might leave the home without telling anyone. And they in fact could be missing at that time. We also know that runaways are also technically missing persons as well. So you might have a teen or a young adult leave home without telling people. You could also have someone who intentionally wants to go missing. And a lot of times we talk about perhaps survivors of domestic violence who are trying to leave an abusive relationship and they don't want to be found. So going missing can be directly related to criminal activity, or it can be not related to criminal activity, and people can go missing, again, intentionally or unintentionally under these circumstances. Next slide, please. Now, we're specifically interested in the issue of missingness within Native American or Indigenous communities. So when we started our work in this area, one of the things that we really wanted to understand and think about was how historically, things unfolding historically could actually impact Native communities being vulnerable to going missing today, right? So we often talk about the ongoing structural inequalities and disparities that can make going missing more likely for certain groups. Now, when we talk about Native American communities, a lot of times I think about how rural some of the tribal lands can be. They can either be very, very big and vast, meaning that the responders like police officers or victim service providers have to cover a lot of ground to respond to, let's say, a report of a missing person. That can actually increase these communities' vulnerability to going missing because they don't have the right responses. They don't have responses that are readily available for them to use. Those lands are also not usually located close to city hubs. And again, that means that the service providers, especially for victim service providers, I think about that a lot, they're going to be even further removed, right? When families are seeking services to deal with having a family member going missing. But one of the things that we did in one of our projects in Nebraska was we actually asked tribal members, what are some of the factors that might influence, be evident in tribal communities and also impact these communities' likelihood of, having missingness be a problem in their communities. And the tribal members came up with a lot of very rich information and detail. They talked about substance use rates being high, unemployment being high as well. But one of the things that I thought was really interesting was they talked about how there was a lot of distrust within tribal communities of, let's call them like system responders, criminal justice actors. And we know, given many Native Americans sort of historical experiences with these system actors and these systems, we know that there's distrust in these communities. But one of the things that they talked about was they're really nervous about potentially reporting like a family member who has gone missing. They're nervous about reporting it to law enforcement, or let's say DHS, because they're afraid that these people or these system actors will then come into the community and basically put the family under a spotlight, right? In other words, they may come in and say, well, this is not a safe environment, and they may take their kids and put them in foster care for a while. And so there's a lot of different reasons and different factors that can increase a community's vulnerability to the problem of going missing. And I think it's really important that researchers, when you're talking about this, that they talk to the communities that are impacted and understand from their perspective what it is that could be influencing this vulnerability. Because we were not thinking originally that foster care involvement might be a problem, right? Next slide, please. So there has been some research come out. Some of it's from us, some of it's from some other places. Idaho, for instance, there's been some work coming out of Arizona as well that has been looking at just the scope of missing persons and whether or not Native American or Indigenous people are in fact disproportionately reported as missing. So one of the studies we did was in Nebraska, and we did find, in fact, that Indigenous people were reported missing at about 3 times their rate of the population in Nebraska. So that's a disproportionate number of Native Americans being reported missing in Nebraska. And then in Idaho, some of our friends did a study similar to ours, and they found that Indigenous people were reported missing at about twice their rate of the population in Idaho. So we're starting to see some research come out that's giving us some indication of how much disparity there is in this problem. We also find that missingness can disproportionately impact like teens and young adults, right? And we also find in both of these studies and both of these sites that going missing does not just impact Indigenous women and girls. So in fact, about a quarter of those Indigenous people who are reported as missing are boys and men, and that's been found in both our site in Nebraska as well as in our in Idaho. Next. Tara, I think this is yours.
Thanks, Emily. Yeah, so Emily's talked a little bit about the work that we've done on missingness in Nebraska, and we have some new work going on in New Mexico now. Like she said, there's been work in Idaho and Arizona, so there's sort of this growing body of research that is really interested in missing persons generally, and then looking at how different communities may be differentially impacted by the problem of missingness, and of course, missingness related to violent victimization, like assaults, domestic violence, homicide, etc. So, you know, one of the contexts that Dr. Wright and I have been exploring is really this connection between gender-based violence and going missing. And so Anobi, go ahead and change the slide. So which could be particularly relevant for TCUs and for folks who are working with college students, with Indigenous college students, you know, specifically at TCUs. So when we talk about gender-based violence, we're talking about sexual assault, dating violence, domestic violence, sexual harassment, stalking, sort of these broad categories of violence that historically have disproportionately impacted women, and now research is really showing also disproportionately impacts the LGBTQIA two-spirit community. We know, particularly from a study that was done a couple of years ago, the National Interpartner and Sexual Violence Survey, there was an oversample of Indigenous folks in this nationally representative sample, and we saw that Native women reported the highest rates of victimization of all race ethnicities, with more than half of Native women reporting experiences with domestic violence, sexual violence, or stalking during their lifetime, which is just, you know, I mean, think about it, 1 in 2. So the impact that that has on Native communities and Native families really cannot be overstated. So, you know, when we're thinking about TCUs and college students and college women and girls specifically, we, you know, have to understand that most, if not all, right, Native women on a college campus are going to have had some either direct personal experience with violence or some indirect experience with violence because of the disproportionate impact that it has on the community at large. So, you know, we know that most, you know, Native college women are going to come to campus probably with some history of either indirect or direct experiences with violence, and then they're going to be at a disproportionate risk of experiencing violence as they, you know, go throughout their emerging adulthood, right? Because that 18 to 24-year-old sort of age range is the time in one's life that one is at most risk of this type of violence, and dating violence, stalking, sexual assault, etc. Anobi, go ahead and flip the slide. So as Dr. Wright talked about experiences with gender-based violence, she touched on this a little bit, provide opportunities for an increased risk of going missing, right? So that we understand that someone who is experiencing domestic violence or dating violence may intentionally go missing to escape their abuser. So in our original study in Nebraska, we spoke with service providers who either served Native communities specifically or had experiences with serving clients who identified as Indigenous. And they talked about this, real struggle to provide that privacy and confidentiality to clients who came seeking shelter, and how it was difficult when, law enforcement, for example, reached out, or when they knew in their community that someone was quote unquote missing, right, had been reported missing, but was indeed safe and sound in their shelter, right? So they needed to be able to provide that confidentiality. They weren't going to, reveal the whereabouts of this missing person, but indeed this person was intentionally missing, right? They were safe, they were sound, but they didn't tell anyone, including their own family, because of those close community ties within their community. They were afraid, if I tell anyone, then the abuser may find out where I am. Of course, there are instances where domestic violence turns fatal, right? Domestic violence escalates and the victim is killed. So, that is a real opportunity for sort of that missing and murdered situation. And then we see over and over in our research these non-custodial abductions. So dependent children who are abducted by that non-custodial parent, and removed from the care of the custodial parent. And all of these scenarios provide opportunities for someone to experience missingness either directly or without those non-custodial abductions indirectly, right? So we can all imagine the impact it would have on a parent, right? Especially a mother, to have their child abducted and to not know where they were and to not know that they're safe. So there's really this potential connection between gender-based violence and going missing. Go ahead and flip the slide, Novi. So how does this apply, directly to TCUs, and what can we do about it, right? What kind of services, what kind of opportunities for empowerment can we start thinking about to share with students, practitioners, administrators? Because the research on this is very sparse, right? So there hasn't been a lot of empirical studies that look at sort of the connections between gender-based violence and going missing, or provide a lot of context for these situations that would easily allow us to say, these are the best practices, these are the things that you can do, right? We're still in the phase where we are sort of brainstorming, bringing these ideas to communities like this webinar, and really asking folks to start thinking about this, to start making these connections, and because this is the way that we're going to improve these services, right? Is really from the grassroots level, from the ground up. So we really want to bring these, sort of overarching themes that we're seeing in the academic literature and the research that we're doing to practitioners like yourselves, and really sort of ask, do you think that this will work for your students, your clients, your populations? Where are places that we can continue to improve upon with these ideas? Okay, Hanabi, go ahead. So the first thing that is really important for I think frontline staff at TCUs to know about is how to report a person missing, right? Because if you are a beloved faculty member, a Title IX coordinator, a counselor on campus, a dean of students, if you're student facing and one of your students has a loved one who goes missing, right? Or if you have a student on your campus that goes missing, you are likely going to be a person that hears about it, right? We know that faculty and staff receive lots of disclosures of gender-based violence from students, and Dr. Wright and I are really starting to sort of conceptualize missingness in that sort of pool of victimization experiences that frontline staff at TCUs really need to start thinking about, right? For so long, we've been trying to sort of train faculty and staff on how to respond if a student discloses gender-based violence to them, right? How to be prepared so that if a student comes to you and says, you know, I've been sexually assaulted, you know, my partner is abusing me at home, you're prepared to respond in a way that's supportive, and, you know, allows that student to get whatever they need from that situation, whether it's just, you know, someone to listen and to believe them, or someone to walk them over to counseling services, or to help them call law enforcement, right? Because it could be this range of needs that this student might have. The same is true for a case of a missing person, right? That student may just need a listening ear, right? Something may have happened in their friend group, in their family, right? Someone is missing. They don't know where they are. They're scared for them. They're worried. And, you know, it's a real concern that is going to create this barrier, or this challenge for them to continue to be successful, you know, at school. So faculty, staff, administrators need to be prepared to receive those disclosures. Students may also need help reporting, right? Reporting a loved one missing. So first and foremost, there is no waiting period to report a person as missing to law enforcement. Federal law and many state laws sort of reify this, actually forbids law enforcement not to take a report of a missing minor, right? So they have to, it's in federal law. Many states have created legislation that state law that codifies that there's no waiting period for an adult. In jurisdictions where there's an absence of the law, right? That simply means that there's no law preventing law enforcement to take a report immediately. So there's no hard and fast rule. It just may mean that the person making the report may have to push a little bit. You know, waiting will hinder an investigation. We know that when a person goes missing, those first few hours or days are incredibly important, right? Because if this is a case of missingness that's unintentional and is related to some sort of crime or violence, or even a mental health challenge, you know, this could be a person who's suicidal, right? Finding that person is most likely the faster you can find them, right? When there are still witnesses, when there's still folks who may know sort of the last few steps or interactions or places that person has gone. The longer and longer you wait, right, the harder and harder it's going to be to find this missing person. When we did our first study in Nebraska, we interviewed not only victim service providers, but also law enforcement. And we interviewed a captain within, at the time, Omaha Police Department Special Victims Unit. And she said, everybody has a supervisor. It is our job as law enforcement to take incident reports. So if if a community member calls and someone will not take an incident report of that for that missing person, then that community member has every right to say, I want to talk to your supervisor, and to go all the way up the chain of command. And I thought that was so powerful. You know, she went on further and talked about how, of course, it shouldn't be on the community member to do that, right? That the community member should call and should immediately have someone that's responsive and ready to take a report. But that if that isn't the case, that everybody has a supervisor. There's always somebody above that person. And so it may mean that the person making the report really has to stand their ground and demand that a report be taken. Reporting to law enforcement is necessary to get a person's information into NamUs or NCMEC, these national forums. So yes, you can directly contact NamUs, but that information is not going to become public facing, right? It's not going to be added to sort of that searchable website that anybody can search and that any law enforcement officer can search, right? Until there is a police report filed, right? So basically until NamUs can cross-check that report. So reporting to law enforcement is sort of a stipulation of getting that information out broadly, and getting that information out to law enforcement, both within that local community and then also beyond that local community. Because you could imagine that if someone, again, has been abducted, or is having a mental health challenge, right? And has, gotten on a bus and not told anyone, right? But may need medication, may be a danger to themselves or others, right? If they're on the move, then the minute they leave the community, right, then it's going to be really important for other law enforcement agencies to be able to access information about that missing person. And the way to do that is, again, to report it to law enforcement and to get it into these national databases. Hanobi, go ahead. So you may be thinking, well, what if my student doesn't want to call law enforcement, right? Because again, we're looking at this through the lens of gender-based violence, and the right to that student to to report to law enforcement or not report, the same way they have the right to other gender, to reporting other gender-based violence on campus, right? Because we know the Violence Against Women Act says that a student has the right to report to law enforcement or not report to law enforcement, right? So they may come to you and they may say, I don't want to call the police, because as Dr. Wright mentioned, there could be many reasons why that community member doesn't trust law enforcement, right? Doesn't trust, depending on where they live, if they're in Indian country, right, doesn't trust that tribal police department. Maybe they are in an abusive relationship, and maybe that abuser has a connection to someone who's on tribal council or someone that's on tribal police, right? Maybe they've had really bad experiences with tribal police before. Maybe they've had experiences with child welfare. There could be a whole host of reasons why they don't want to report to law enforcement. So we are seeing more and more open source platforms. And what I mean by this is Twitter, Facebook, TikTok, that is dedicated to spreading the word about missing persons. And there are many of these platforms that have dedicated pages to missing American Indian, Alaska Native folks. And so here's just a couple of examples of different Facebook pages that are specific, and websites that are specific to missing Indigenous persons. So if you have a student come and report to you, you have a situation where the student is disclosing, but they don't want to report to law enforcement, this is another option, right? So we are not saying these are the things that you should convince a student to do. We're saying here is sort of the buffet of options that you might talk to your students about, right? Because victim survivors deserve choices, right? That's what we say in the broader gender-based violence space, is that as service providers and support providers, we don't want to tell a victim what to do, because then we're just mirroring an abusive relationship. We want to provide choices. We want to provide options. We want to educate them about, the different responses that are out there, and then we want to let them make the choices. But this could be an alternative or a supplement to reporting to law enforcement, right? Okay, go ahead. So another sort of component to this is the sort of professional victim services space. We did, again, speak with victim service providers in Nebraska, and we saw over and over and over with our interviews with victims serving professionals that they understood the problem of missing or murdered Indigenous persons. They understood that that was a problem. They knew, they had heard about it. They knew, they had read about it. They maybe had heard podcasts or heard about Operation Lady Justice at the federal level, but they didn't know how they could be helpful, right? They didn't know a lot about missing persons. They didn't know a lot about reporting missing persons. And for many of them, they said, the funding strategy that funds us as a rape crisis center or a domestic violence shelter, it would make it really hard for us to serve someone who came in and said, you know, my loved one is missing, you know, I really am looking for advocacy or, you know, counseling services, that wouldn't really be a scenario where they could serve that person because it doesn't fall under sort of their umbrella of services. So, you know, what Dr. Wright and I really started thinking about was the need for these missing persons advocates or these liaisons. And we're seeing these pop up in different states and different jurisdictions, oftentimes at the sort of state level in the state's attorney general's office, oftentimes is where we're seeing these liaisons pop up. But we really think there's an opportunity, a need there to have advocates that really understand the process of reporting a missing person, the process of sort of the investigation or lack thereof, and understanding the needs of that loved one. You could imagine that in many ways, having a loved one go missing is similar to having a loved one be killed in a violent death, right? But in this scenario, you don't know if they're alive or dead, right? So there really could be sort of long-term advocacy and counseling needs that loved one who would be the victim in this scenario, right? Would really incur. So some of the responsibilities or some of the services that a missing persons advocate might provide are things like helping that person file a missing persons report, right? Serving as a liaison between loved ones of a missing person and law enforcement. Similar to what we see in victim advocacy for victims of domestic violence, rape and sexual assault, right? That oftentimes an advocate will come along with the victim survivor if they're going to be interviewed by, you know, investigators, if they're going to have, you know, any kind of exam, speak with a prosecutor, that kind of thing. They'll have that support provider with them. So you could imagine that, you know, there may be meetings, there may be, you know, cases where investigators want to talk with the loved ones, and an advocate could be really helpful. Because that, you know, advocate can sort of be attuned to how that loved one's feeling, right? Do they need a break? Do they need a glass of water, right? Is the investigator starting to sort of interrogate them, right? Because that's what law enforcement is trained to do, is interrogate suspects, not necessarily interview victim survivors, right? And the loved ones of victim survivors. They can advocate on their behalf, right? So if you have a law enforcement department that is hesitant to take a report or is not taking the report seriously, right? That advocate could kind of help sort of advocate on behalf of the investigation. And then provide referrals to loved ones, right? So if we sort of think about the loved one of a missing person as, you know, sort of experiencing this trauma of having a loved one go missing and potentially stay missing, they are likely going to need long-term services. So what we know right now is that overwhelmingly victim service providers are not trained in the missing persons sort of process or some of the context that we've been discussing here today, whether it's community-based advocates or system advocates, because many law enforcement departments or attorney general's offices, they have victim advocates. But the sort of missingness has not really been seen as a type of victimization that could benefit from victim advocacy. And so Dr. Wright and I really want to sort of turn that on its head and start thinking about, you know, can we, you know, provide supportive services to the loved ones of missing persons. So this could be a real opportunity for I think staff and administrators at TCUs to start helping to build this capacity, right? Because it only takes one student at your at your college or universities to experience this for your entire campus community to experience it, right? And so you know, this could be a real opportunity to start thinking about who, you know, at either the tribal coalition level, the TCU level, the local service provider level, the community-based service provider level, the tribal police department, local law enforcement, all of these different sort of, system and community spaces, who could potentially serve in this capacity, and where could we start building those bridges, to start having those conversations. If you've already experienced this on your campus, if you've had students either go missing or have sort of the impact of having a loved one go missing, you might think about what went, did anything go well for them? Did they get the support that they needed? And or what did they not get, right? And really think about how could we do things differently next time? Okay, Hanobi. So, this is kind of last but not least, in terms of, again, thinking about what are the choices, the options, in regard to missingness. So there has been this movement, and this has really been a grassroots movement, regarding sort of if I go missing, right? You may have heard of like if I go missing files, if I go missing folders, right? Where individuals in high-risk communities, and this has really been targeted, I think, among Indigenous persons and in the African American community, both communities that experience disproportionate rates of missingness, really thinking about how can I be empowered as an individual to help solve my own case if I go missing. Really sort of taking into consideration that oftentimes law enforcement don't take reports of missing persons, especially if they're young, right? Oh, they'll be back. They're probably just out partying. They probably just went on a trip and didn't tell you, he or she's 23. Young people do this, right? So sort of in the vein of, what if this isn't taken seriously? And by the time it is, a lot of time has passed and it's very difficult to locate the person. So, in sort of this vein, there's been this movement to sort of consider, is there a trusted person in my life, right, that I could share important information with that would be crucial to finding me, right? And so you could think about sort of that digital footprint. That digital footprint is so key. Most young people today, I say that as a person who can't believe that I'm no longer in that category. Most young people today, right, have a very significant digital footprint, right? So they are on Instagram, they're on Twitter, they're on TikTok, they're on Snapchat. Their smartphone is their, entire world, right? That, there are ways, right, through that digital footprint to track someone. I mean, and for many, sort of adolescents and emerging adults, almost, minute by minute, track where they are, and when they're connected, when they're not connected. So things like social media logins, Find My Phone, air tags, other ways to track someone's location, bank and credit card login information. Again, this is, these are things that you would only want to share with a trusted person, right? Because these are really personal, significant sort of data points in one's life. But you could imagine that if someone had this information and they were able to easily identify when was the last time this person spent any money, right? Use their debit card or their credit card. When was the last time they checked in on, on Instagram or on Facebook? They're always checking in like every 20 minutes, and then all of a sudden they stop. That's not normal behavior for this person. So where were they when they stopped? Who were they with, right? That, sort of Find My iPhone or those AirTag functions that, literally provide a geolocation for someone. These are data points that law enforcement would be very interested in accessing. But of course, it takes, law enforcement being serious about an investigation and oftentimes getting a warrant to access these things. So especially with bank records and phone records, it can take quite a bit of time before a bank or a phone service provider is going to, a cell phone service provider is going to give you access. Same thing with social media, right? So these might be some things to consider speaking with your students about if you're going to do any sort of training or education around missingness in your community or at your campus. And then, there's also, I think real opportunities if you're doing sort of training and education around digital wellness or digital health, to think about sort of the flip side of this, right? We're talking about share these data points with a trusted person in your life, your mother, your uncle, your best friend, right? Of, 15 years. Because the flip side of this is, having this data access is a way that abusers can exert control over their victim partner, and or could really do, harm and violence and perpetrate gender-based violence against someone. So really thinking, sort of cautiously about how do we sort of educate students around sort of the power of this type of material, right? To truly track someone. And this information could be used to benefit if someone goes missing, but it also could be used as a tool to harm someone and to really move someone into sort of a missingness space, right, that is connected to violence or victimization. All right, Hanobi, we're ready. All right, thank you so much. That's Dr. Wright, do you have anything else to add in terms of especially sort of those last slides around prevention and intervention?
Yeah, I mean, not really. You really did cover everything so well, as you always do. I would just say that, I think it is important to empower potential victims of, going missing, but I hate that we even have to talk about that because I really think that getting a coordinated response to this issue between law enforcement, victim service providers, things like that. I really think that this should be a national priority and one for the prevention of violence and further victimization. So my hope is that we can get our act together as a nation, so to speak, and start to fund these kind of organizations, see them as valid and important contributors to the prevention of violence and victimization, and that we don't say, well, this is really about the potential victim, arming themselves, so to speak, to prevent it, or to help us solve their own case. So that's my hope. But I know in the intermediate space, we probably do need to talk a lot about, these if I go missing kind of prevention techniques. So I'll stop there, but thank you everyone for listening to us. We really appreciate being able to share this with you and that you've given us almost an hour of your time. We do have a few minutes for questions, but I want to let Hanobi maybe take over at this point so he can moderate if they come up.
All right, thank you both. So yeah, as stated at the beginning of the webinar, if you have any questions, you can put them into the chat, into the Q&A, or if you prefer to verbalize your questions, you can click the little hand icon and we will unmute you so you can say it out loud.
thanks everybody for the nice, the kind words coming up in the chat. Dr. Wright and I will also say, that we are, okay, so I do see a question as well, and I'll respond to that in 1 second. If we can ever be of any help, just reach out to us directly. We are subject matter experts on, Redwind's holistic response to sexual assault at TCUs. And, we're continuing to do this work, and we are always ready to sort of help bring research capacity to institutions that are looking to sort of do this work. That's what we love to do. So I see this question from Nicole. In Idaho, what region was the data from, north or south? So Nicole, this was a statewide study. It was led by Boise State University. And you can, I probably actually can put the final report in the chat for you in just a second. This was a collaboration between faculty at the Boise State University's School of Criminal Justice, as well as a state level task force. I know that many folks from Indigenous communities in Idaho were involved, and one of the researchers, she identifies as an Indigenous woman. So I believe this was again statewide, but that would, if you're interested in the report, I really would, encourage you to read it. But I will look it up real quick, and I think I can probably pull it. Yep. All right. So, and I'll put it here in the chat for you. And there it is. You can check it out. So Melanie Fillmore was the lead researcher, and she is a citizen of the Standing Rock Sioux Tribe of South Dakota, and the task force. Oh, very, very, very cool. So, well, great. And I encourage you, if you are looking for sort of research collaborators, I know that the team at Boise State, they're amazing. So I'm sure they'd love to hear from you.
Hey, Tara, I wonder if you could drop a link to like our final report maybe from Nebraska. I'm tech not as good as you, so, but we could we'll put that in the chat as well. And this is a final report from our first project, looking at really the scope of missing Native Americans in Nebraska. And I want to say we finished that around 2021, maybe. But we referenced it in the talk today.
Yes, so I can do that. I see the note from Jolene about can we send an email? You absolutely can. An alternative would be, so my research lab at UNO is V as in Victor, srlab.org. So vvsrlab.org. And if you go to that website, there's a tab for featured publications, and it has links to our research from Nebraska, both in terms of sort of the prevalence and context of missing persons, as well as an article specific to victim service providers. So when we were talking about sort of the need for missing persons advocates and reports from the field and all of that, we have an article that's specific to that. It's there as well. But I am going to put the link that I just put into the chat is the paper that we wrote on sort of the prevalence and context of missing persons in Nebraska. And then I can also link to the other article I was just referencing.
Alrighty, do we have any final questions before we wrap up? All right, well, I will bring up the references page so that everyone can see this.
Oh, yeah, and that's a list of lots of the research we were just discussing, including the Idaho report.
Since I am not seeing any more questions, we will get to wrapping up the webinar. So thank you, Doctors Emily and Dr. Tara. Before we end the session, I want to let you all know that there will be an eval popping up once Zoom closes. We'd love to hear what you thought, so if you're able to fill that out, we'd very much appreciate it. As a reminder, this webinar was recorded and will be uploaded onto Redwind's YouTube channel within the next few days. And you can also find our previous recordings there. In closing, I'd like to thank our presenters, Dr. Richards and Dr. Wright, and I'd like to thank all of you for joining us. Hope you all have a wonderful rest of your day. I hope you all stay safe, and I hope to see you all at the next webinar.